Round 1 of the 2023 Supercars Championship is run and done. We've seen the brand new cars, the Gen 3 machines, racing in anger for the very first time, and today I'm going to recap the whole weekend and just share my thoughts on this opening head out of racing. So I think it's fair to say that race 1 wasn't exactly a thriller. I was absolutely dying for a safety car halfway through that race. Unfortunately, nothing really came to spice up the action, and for all the new cars and the excitement that we've had, that race unfolded pretty much like most supercars races in recent years, with Red Bull and Shane Van Gisbergen in particular getting a great tyre strategy down and pretty much just schooling everybody else when it came towards the back end of that race. But unfortunately, there wasn't too much entertainment down the field either. There seemed to be some issues with tyres potentially overheating, which seemed to be a common thread, as drivers just didn't appear willing to get too close to the car in front, and maybe a little lack of confidence in there as well, because we saw a lot more ambition on the Sunday as people seemed to get used to their new cars. But while the race itself was quiet, we had absolute controversy pretty much the moment the flag dropped, the checkered flag came down, with Red Bull being protested. So the results as they crossed the line, it was SVG followed by Brock Feeney and Cameron Waters in third, but the Red Bulls were later disqualified on a technical infringement we'll get to shortly, which meant the actual results at the time of recording is Waters, Mostert, and then Brody Kostecki. Now I say at the time of recording because Red Bull are appealing the disqualification decision, and we'll get talking about the ins and outs of that one very shortly. In terms of race 2, this one was far more exciting. This was the kind of thing I was hoping to see on the Saturday. It was a shame we didn't have a more explosive start on the Saturday, but sometimes even if the rules are amazing, and I'm not suggesting they are out of the box, but some races ignite, some don't. That's just the way it goes sometimes. But fortunately, Sunday was a lot more entertaining. I guess one of the key moments in that race was actually with Cameron Waters chasing down Mostert for the lead. He made a major mistake clipping the inside wall at the exit of what I like to call the staircase section and damaged his steering. He was still able to finish the race around about the top 10 mark, but unfortunately wasn't able to be at the front, which is a shame because we could have had a 3-car fight for the lead. But we had that fight for the lead regardless with 2 cars, and well, Saturday that saw controversy off track with the disqualification, and Sunday saw controversy on track with a little bit of contact in the dying laps. The results though, once again, Shane Van Gisbergen crossed the line first and he wasn't disqualified from this race. Mostert was in second, and Reynolds, a great result for the Grove Racing team, down there in third place. In terms of the championship, leading Newcastle, this is quite interesting because of the disqualification. Where I estimated everyone would be in the championships doesn't quite line up with where they actually are. So Chaz Mostert actually leads the way, followed by Brody Kostecki, Cam Waters, Davey Reynolds, and Heimgardner kind of sneaking up there in 5th. A very solid but reasonably quiet weekend for him. On the team side of things, it's actually Erebus that are leading the way, followed by Penrite, Team 18, who have also been a bit quiet but doing quite well. Walkinshaw Andretti United, unfortunately Percat wasn't quite as strong as Mostert. And Tickford, despite having quite a bit of carnage, the poor guys, they are in 5th. In my Newcastle preview video, I made some predictions. Now, these were just a bit of fun, and I'm planning to do these kinds of predictions all year long, but I did want to swing back by here and see how I went. So I made the prediction that there would be Sainz, AAA, and DJR have an advantage on the others in terms of their understanding of the new cars. I don't really know whether I claim victory on this one because we have the 2 extremes. Red Bull, I think, were the most convincing team for race pace across both days, so that kind of checks the prediction there. But then on the other hand, we have DJR, who were at the other end of things. They were pretty much nowhere, much to my surprise. They've had a rocky couple of years. I thought Gen 3 would be a bit of a reset for them, but the opening round in Newcastle has been pretty brutal, so hopefully they get back on their feet soon. So I'm going to award myself half a point for that one. My second prediction was that Cam Waters would assert himself and Tickford as title challengers. Now, I'm going to take the win. I'm going to take the W for Cam Waters asserting himself. I think he's leading or leaving Newcastle third in the championship, despite that mistake on the Sunday. So I think had he not made that mistake, he could have even been leading the Drivers' Championship, but he certainly can't afford to make those kinds of mistakes too often throughout the year. Tickford, on the other hand, though, I was probably a bit ambitious considering them as team title challengers. Obviously, very early days, but they still seem to have that poor old curse of everyone but Cam Walder's car ending up with crash damage. And that brings us to the final prediction, and that's that at least one car wouldn't start on Sunday due to damage or a lack of spares. And unfortunately, that driver was James Courtney, crashed out in the top 10 shootout and could not make the start. So now that we've got to know each other for a few minutes, if you are new around here, let's get controversial. I asked you guys what you thought of the Red Bull disqualification that happened after Saturday's race. Now, if you missed the headlines, as I understand it, and I'm not the most technical fan, I'll be the first to admit it, but as I understand, there were rules in place that said your driver or your icebox system must be installed in where the passenger seat would go in the cars. Red Bull installed their system between the driver and the driver's side door. Now, when I first heard that this issue had been raised, I didn't think they'd get disqualified because I couldn't see a performance advantage there, but when I woke up on the Sunday and learned that yes, indeed, Red Bull were kicked out of race 1, they actually cited it was a safety issue because where they installed it on the right-hand side of the driver, that was meant to be a crumple zone, and there were obvious safety issues by putting, systems and apparatus in that area. For me, I thought this one was justified. When it comes to matters of safety, it's very hard not to go straight to the harshest punishment. So I feel like Motorsport Australia's hands were a bit tied on this one. And 60% of you also agreed with that view, saying that the disqualification was justified. But we do have a fairly even split with 40% saying it was an overreaction. I do also have a little bit of sympathy here because the run-up to Gen 3 has been so chaotic. There was always a chance there were going to be some more technical nuances that had a few grey areas surrounding them. Now we get to a segment that I'm calling Clash Chat. This is where I'm going to take the largest on-track incident from each weekend and just unpick it in a little bit more detail, share your thoughts, share my thoughts, and just have a bit of a chat about the incident. Now, the obvious candidate out of Newcastle for this segment of the show was a collision between Shane Van Gisbergen and Mostert during the fight for the lead in the second race. Now, to give you a bit of plotline, if you need a bit of a refresher or didn't see the race, Shane Van Gisbergen had a lot fresher tyres, was chasing down Mostert for the win with about 10 laps to go. They entered the staircase section of the racetrack. Mostert was on quite a defensive line, Shane on an attacking line, and unfortunately the two made contact and Mostert got pushed wide at the apex and Gizzy went through. Now, when I first saw this, I thought Shane Van Gisbergen was in a lot of trouble. I thought he'd pretty much run him wide at the apex and done a bit of a bump and run, but my view started to change pretty rapidly when I saw the helicopter shot. So you can see a screenshot of that here, and Gizzy actually has an overlap on Mostert here. And my understanding of the rules, and again, I'm just a fan with a mic in a room, but my understanding of the rules are that Mostert has to respect this overlap here. If Gisbergen was on the left, on the inside, trying to overtake, that wouldn't be permitted because he's just not far enough alongside to claim that part of the track. But I understand if he's not initiating an overtake, he's already claimed this part of the track, and unfortunately Mostert just kept coming across on him and initiated the contact, which ended up resulting in him being pushed wide. So I asked you guys what you thought of this one. I thought this one was a racing incident, and that's where the majority of you guys fell as well. We had 101 people respond to this poll, and 30% said Gizzy should have been penalised, only 3% Mostert, and 67% said a racing incident, which, as I said, is kind of where I fall on this one. Two other things I'd like to add to this conversation. The first one is that this incident may have been partly due to the fact that visibility is a bit harder in these new cars. Chaz Mostert may not have seen that Giz had a bit of an overlap there, which may have played a role in the incident. And the second thing I want to add is that I want to see more of this stuff. Let's take SVG out of the equation. Let's take Mostert out of the equation. Let's take the logos off the cars and just look at these as two blank race cars going hard for a race win. That's what I want to see. That, for me, is what Gen 3 has been about and the kind of thing I've been envisioning all these years. So I hope we see more on-track racing like this. I hope we see, this typical touring car stuff that I feel like we've been missing for a few years now. Of course, I want it to be fair, but I love the entertainment more than anything else, and hopefully we're going to see a lot more close action like this throughout the year. Anyway, now that I've probably triggered carnage in the comments, we get to another segment of the show called Carnage Report. This is where I'm going to take a look at other major incidents from the weekend that caused substantial damage to some race cars, and unfortunately, both of the key incidents from this weekend involve Tickford. So, first major shunt we had for Gen 3 was James Courtney in the top 10 shootout for Sunday. He clipped the inside wall going into the staircase section, ricocheted into the outside concrete wall, and did a heap of front end damage. This one reminded me a lot of Chaz Mostert's crash while he was also at Tickford a few years ago at Surfers Paradise. They're reasonably slow incidents, but man, they do some damage, and unfortunately, James Courtney could not make the start of the Sunday race. And Tickford's luck didn't get much better in the race itself. Declan Fraser in the tradie Mustang got caught up with Macaulay Jones. That saw Fraser go into the pit wall, actually the access gate that's on the pit wall, in a pretty heavy fashion, and it moved the pit wall back, so it was great to see that the marshals behind there were unhurt, but unfortunately it ruled the tradie Mustang out of the rest of that race, and once again a pretty big damage bill for Tickford. They just seem to have that curse that those cars just find trouble all year long, and that seems to be continuing into Gen 3, which is quite unfortunate. Let's start wrapping things up by looking at the key takeaways from the weekend. We'll start with the positives, the weekend wins as I'm going to call them, and the first one, and this is all personal opinion, but I love the attitude of these new Gen 3 cars. They spit flames, they move around, they're a lot looser compared to Gen 2. We saw a huge moment from Will Davidson into the hairpin at one point. I think they're just a lot more entertaining to watch. I love the aggression of them. Raceability, jury's still out a little bit on that one, but in terms of the cars by themselves doing a hot lap, I think they're a big improvement. The second main positive is there wasn't that much crash damage. I was expecting things to be a lot worse going into Newcastle. There were a few incidents that we've discussed, but by and large, considering how much more difficult these new cars are, considering how tight and twisty Newcastle is as a track, I think it was actually a lot cleaner than I expected. Now, that may have also contributed to the boring race on Saturday, but from the team owner's perspective, I'm sure they're happy to be leaving Newcastle with reasonably low amounts of damage. Finally, the helmet cameras were back. I flagged this in my Newcastle preview, and I said I was hoping they would be improved, and they did seem to be. It feels like they handle sunlight coming through the visor a lot better. That may be just due to the conditions at Newcastle, but they were certainly a lot easier on the eyes. And yeah, I wouldn't want to see these things as the primary way of viewing a race, but it's definitely nice to see the driver's perspective every now and then. So, big win, big thumbs up from me on the helmet cameras. It wasn't all positive though. Let's get into the weekend woes, as I'm calling them, and the first one is that there's a bit of off-track friction. There's a lot more than I think anyone expected so early on in the season. Pretty much the moment the flag dropped on Saturday, drivers were, there was issues between teams with protests about the legality of cars. There were issues between drivers and supercars around what they can and can't say about the new vehicles. It just felt like everybody was at each other's throats, and I hope this really calms down going into the AGP, and we see a few people shake some hands and sort of move on and focus on making this new gen of car a lot better than it currently is. I don't think it's bad, but there's certainly room for improvement. And that brings us to the second thing I've got written down here, which are tyres the weakest link in Gen 3? Now, this was one of the points of contention on the Saturday. SVG cited that the tyres were overheating and that might have been impacting the racing. Sounds like that might have upset a few people in the higher echelons of the Supercars organization, but I think it was pretty obvious to see, to be honest with you. We could see that a lot of drivers were hanging back, protecting their tyres, not really being willing to go for an overtake. But then again, on Sunday, we did see a lot more of that stuff. So I'm not sure if it was just still getting used to the cars, but yeah, tyres are definitely going to be one to watch in the coming rounds, and hopefully we get an idea if there are any issues there, and if there are, hopefully Dunlop can bring a new spec of tyre. Ideally mid-season if it's a big problem, but if not, next year. Then finally, there were quite a few technical loose ends. I expected these given how chaotic the run-up to Gen 3 was. We obviously saw big issues with cabin temperatures. David Reynolds, Will Brown especially seemed to be in a real bad way getting out of their cars on Saturday. Wheels, they still have a lot of issues getting those wheels on and making sure they're not cross-threading them. We actually saw a lot of teams sort of hand-winding those wheel nuts before they put the rattle guns on them. They could get away with doing that in Newcastle because they were covered by fuel, but when we get to the AGP, and I don't think there's refueling there, you know, it's going to be interesting to see what they do if they still feel the need to sort of hand wind them, because that's going to cost them time. And finally, general durability wasn't the greatest in terms of bodywork. The engines and architecture of the cars seemed to be pretty solid for reliability, but it's things like bodywork which took a real punishment around Newcastle. Brad Jones Racing shared what their side skirts looked like and a few other parts of the car as well, so I'll link that video down in the description, but it really shows just how much damage those body parts took, and I imagine they're going to look to try and increase the lifespan of them moving forward. Overall, I would say the Newcastle weekend, the debut of Gen 3, I would call it solid. It wasn't fantastic, it wasn't terrible, it was just kind of in the middle there. It was slightly on the positive side, I think, which is definitely helped by the fact the Sunday race was the more entertaining of the two. I've definitely got a bit of recency bias going on there. But, you know, when you consider how chaotic the run was up to Gen 3 with, you know, questions around if the cars would even be ready, I think it went reasonably well, but there's still plenty of things that need to be tidied up, and again, probably the biggest question mark is over the tyres, but we'll get a better idea of where they're at in the coming races. Alright, let's wrap up with some audience questions. This is again something I want to make a regular thing in my race review, so a big thank you to everybody that submitted a question. I've only picked 3 here, but very appreciative of everybody that took the time to write something down. First one is from Chris Croft, who asks, does Newcastle need a change for better racing? Now, I think the obvious answer here is yes, but it's kind of the Monaco challenge in F1 where I think everyone knows changes need to be made to improve it, but you're kind of limited by your geography. Pretty much the only realistic changes I could foresee were maybe to the final hairpin, that turn 11 that they often play with the geometry. Maybe some further tweaking can be done there, although it seems to be reasonably good for overtaking this weekend. Other than that, there's not really a whole lot you can do, and other than a major track extension, which I think is unlikely given that it sounds like this race is, you know, a bit touch and go with the local community as to whether they want it or not, so I think we're going to see the track largely the same. The only thing I did spot, and I love doing this, I love getting on Google Maps and seeing what can be done to racetracks to potentially improve them. The only thing I could spot was potentially at turn 1. So this is turn 1 at the moment. They have this left-hander going onto Watt Street, very tight corner, not really an overtaking opportunity. It does generate mistakes, which can lead to overtakes at turn 2, but it in itself is not an overtaking chance. So hypothetically, and I'm not a Newcastle local, I haven't been on the ground here, so this is all from Google Maps, so take it with a major pinch of salt. I wonder if they could do something here with the what appears to be a bus port or a bus stop. This would see the cars carry on a little bit further, making this straight a bit longer. And I wonder if they could, and again, controversial potentially, chop down a tree here, move the curbing back to widen up the apex, and actually make something of a hairpin there that the drivers go through. Now, even if they removed that tree and curbing, it would still be very, very tight, and not necessarily an overtaking opportunity either. But the main reason I make this suggestion is that you have this massive width of tarmac on the exit, and this is where you could potentially see some drivers taking alternative lines, like we saw with Gizzy and Moster in the staircase section, and, you know, maybe see some different exit speeds going up Watt Street. So that's pretty much the only potential major change I can see that's possible to this track without making a major extension. And even then, that one's, I think, a bit ambitious. It's probably a little bit naive for me to suggest that's possible, but nevertheless, I like talking about this kind of stuff, so I thought I'd throw the idea out there. The second question is from Kyle Hocking, who says, what's your opinion on Mark Skaife's comments towards SVG and Reynolds? Now, I am going to build a fence and sit on it here. I don't really want to take a stance on this one, if I'm honest. When I first saw the press conference with Shane Van Gisbergen on the Sunday, I was, especially as a GM fan, pretty disappointed with the way he was carrying himself, but it became pretty apparent in the days that followed that there's been a lot going on behind the scenes between the drivers and supercars and the media muddled in there as well, just to make things even more tense. So I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes, in all regards. And I think there's a lot of stuff we may not be able to fully appreciate or inform ourselves on as fans either. So I'm not really going to take a stance on this one. I just hope everyone kind of cools off going into the AGP, and that if there are any long-standing issues or issues with the cars, especially when it comes to things like heat and driver safety and comfort, hopefully those get addressed pretty quick smart. The final question is from Ryan Parkinson, who says, are there plans to fix the wheels not going on? Now, I kind of like the bluntness of this question, and I don't know if there's actual formal plans, but I'm sure, as with the whole car from top to bottom, the teams are working on solutions for, some of the temporary fixes they had to put in place for Newcastle. Again, some of these problems were found quite late in the process, just before Newcastle, so I'm expecting throughout the whole season we're going to be seeing a lot more refinement going on, a lot of technical revisions to help deal with things like the wheels being more challenging to get on the cars. And fingers crossed, by the end of the season, everyone's pretty happy with where the cars are at. But that is my Newcastle review done and dusted. Thank you so much for your support and patience. I was a little bit crook earlier this week, which meant there was a bit of a delay for me to record and edit this video and bring it to you guys. So thank you for waiting around for this one. If you like what I'm doing here, please do like and subscribe, and be sure to let me know your thoughts down there in the comments. On that note, please remember to treat people like your trackside, whether that's me or other people in the comments. I've shared a lot of personal opinion in this video. It is just that. And when it comes to sport, views aren't always going to align. But that doesn't mean that we can't share the sport, share the passion together, and hopefully we all keep things pretty civil down there in the comments section. The next event for Supercars is supporting the Formula 1 at the Australian Grand Prix from March 30 to April 2. Really looking forward to this one. I chuckle at the thought of Supercars' international racing relatives coming to town and everyone being told to be on their best behavior, but I'm sure that's not going to be the case. I'm sure we're going to have plenty to talk about both in the lead up to the Grand Prix and after it as well. So if you love the Supercars content, hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and hopefully you'll stick around for future content and videos coming very, very soon.